Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The offer that changed everything. Imagine your partner comes home one evening, drops their briefcase on the floor, and says, "I got offered a job. It pays 3 times what I make now. But we'd have to move across the country." That happened to me 3 years ago, and I swear my heart stopped beating for a solid 5 seconds. 3 times the salary. 3 times. That number kept echoing in my head like a broken record. We weren't struggling, we were comfortable, stable, happy, but 3 times the money? That wasn't just an upgrade. That was a completely different life. Better schools for our daughter. A bigger house. Trips back home to visit my family. Financial security so solid that we would never have to worry again. It was the kind of offer that people dream about. The kind of offer that makes you question every decision you've ever made. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at Michael, and feeling this strange mixture of excitement and terror. My brain was already racing ahead, imagining all the things we could do with that money. I could finally send my parents the support they needed. We could save for our daughter's college fund. We could actually start planning for the future instead of just surviving the present. But then Michael said something that stopped my train of thought completely. He said, "I told them I need to think about it." Think about it? I almost laughed out loud. What was there to think about? It was more money than we had ever seen. It was a promotion, a title, a position that would make his career skyrocket. It was everything we had been working toward for years. Why would he even hesitate? And then I saw the look on his face, the hesitation, the doubt, the quiet fear that I hadn't noticed before. And I realized, in that moment, that this decision wasn't about money at all. It was about something much bigger. Something that I hadn't even considered. Something that would test our marriage, our values, and our understanding of what truly matters in life. He didn't look like a man who had just been given the opportunity of a lifetime. He looked like a man who was about to lose something precious. I asked him what was wrong, and he said, "If we move, we leave everything. Our home. Our friends. Your job. The school our daughter loves. Your mother's visits. Everything." And I felt the weight of his words settle on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. He was right. We wouldn't just be gaining money. We would be losing everything else. And I had been so focused on the dollar signs that I had completely ignored the cost. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that I had never seen Michael so conflicted. And that terrified me more than anything. But the biggest surprise was still to come, because Michael wasn't done making decisions that would change our lives forever. And what he did next made me love him more than I ever thought possible. The American dream or a trap? Here's something nobody tells you about the American dream: it doesn't always look like what you imagined. Sometimes it shows up wearing a fancy suit, holding a briefcase full of cash, and smiling like it's the best thing that ever happened to you. And that's exactly what happened to us. For the next 2 weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about that number. 3 times our current salary. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, and calculate all the things we could do with that money. A bigger house with a yard for our daughter to play in. A new car that didn't make strange noises when I started it. The ability to visit my family back home without worrying about the cost of plane tickets. The freedom to finally stop stressing about every single bill. It felt like a door had opened, and on the other side was everything we had ever wanted. But Michael didn't see it that way. He saw the door, but he also saw what was on the other side, an empty house where we had built memories. A school that would miss our daughter. Friends who had become family. The community that had wrapped its arms around us when we arrived in this country with nothing but hope. He said, "Money isn't everything, you know." And I almost laughed. I had grown up in a family where money was everything. Where every single decision was based on survival, on making ends meet, on scraping together enough to get through the month. Money wasn't just important to me, it was security. It was peace. It was the difference between sleeping soundly and waking up in the middle of the night wondering how we would pay the bills. How could he not see that? How could he be so casual about something that had defined my entire childhood? I was so focused on the money that I couldn't see what he was trying to tell me. I kept pushing, kept arguing, kept listing all the reasons why this offer was too good to refuse. And Michael kept listening, kept nodding, kept saying I understand in that calm, patient voice that always made me feel both loved and completely unheard. I thought I was fighting for our future. I thought I was being practical, realistic, ambitious. But I was just scared. Scared of going back to the way I grew up. Scared of never having enough. Scared of passing that fear on to our daughter. And I was so consumed by that fear that I couldn't see the truth, that Michael wasn't rejecting the money. He was rejecting what the money would cost us. But I didn't understand that yet. I was too busy being angry, too busy feeling like he was throwing away our future. Too busy being the practical one who was trying to save us from poverty. I had no idea that the real lesson was still coming. And it would come from the most unexpected place, from our daughter, who would say something so simple, so honest, so heartbreaking, that it would change everything I thought I knew about success. But first, I had to hit rock bottom. I had to push Michael so hard that he finally snapped and told me the truth about why he was really hesitating. And that truth would make me question everything I had ever believed about love, sacrifice, and what it really means to choose family over money. The fight that almost broke us. You know that moment when a conversation goes from calm to chaotic in a single sentence? That's exactly what happened to us. We had been discussing the job offer for weeks, circling around it like two cautious animals, never quite saying what we really felt. But then one night, after our daughter was asleep and the house was quiet, everything exploded. I had been pushing, gently at first, then with more force, trying to convince Michael that this opportunity was too good to pass up. And he had been quiet, patient, nodding along but never agreeing. Finally, I snapped. "Why won't you even consider it?" I shouted, slamming my hand on the table. "This is everything we've worked for. This is security, stability, a future. How can you just throw that away?" Michael's face went pale. He stood up, walked to the window, and stared out into the darkness for a long time. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Because I'm scared," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of becoming like my father." I froze. Michael had never talked about his father, not really. I knew they had a complicated relationship, that he had grown up with a father who was always working, always chasing the next promotion. Always absent. But he had never told me the whole story. So I sat there, completely silent, and listened. He told me about a childhood spent waiting for a man who was never there. About birthdays missed, school plays attended by empty chairs, dinners eaten alone with his mother. About a father who chose career over family, who kept saying this is for us while never actually being there. And he said, I refuse to do that to our daughter. I refuse to be a ghost in her life. No amount of money is worth that. I felt the air leave my lungs. All those weeks of pushing, arguing, trying to convince him to take the job, and I had completely missed the point. He wasn't being stubborn or foolish. He was trying to protect his family from a pain he had lived through himself. He was choosing to break a cycle that had defined his childhood. He was choosing to be present rather than successful. I reached across the table and took his hand. I didn't know, I said, my voice shaking. You never told me. He turned to look at me, and I saw tears in his eyes, the first time I had ever seen him cry. I didn't know how to tell you, he said. I didn't want you to think I was weak. But I can't do it. I can't take that job. I can't become someone my daughter barely remembers. In that moment, everything shifted. I stopped seeing the money. I stopped seeing the house, the car, the security I thought we needed. All I could see was my husband, terrified of repeating his father's mistakes, desperately trying to be a better man. And I realized that I had been so focused on the future that I had ignored the present, the family we already had, the life we were already building. The love that was right in front of me. I didn't need more money. I needed to understand the man I married. And finally, for the first time, I did. But our journey wasn't over yet. Because now I had to face the next challenge, what my family would think when they found out Michael had turned down the opportunity of a lifetime. And I knew their reaction would not be as understanding as mine. The pressure from both families. Here's something nobody warns you about when you marry someone from a different culture. You don't just marry them. You marry their family's expectations, their history, their unspoken rules. And when you add money into the mix, everything becomes 10 times more complicated. After Michael told me about his father, I was ready to support whatever decision he made. I had finally understood why he couldn't take that job. I had finally seen the fear behind his hesitation. But the rest of the world didn't see it that way. And the rest of the world included my family back home, thousands of miles away, who had completely different ideas about what success meant. When I called my mother to tell her about the job offer, I didn't tell her that Michael had refused it. I told her he was considering it, that we were weighing our options. And I heard the excitement in her voice. 3 times the salary? She repeated. That's so much money. That's life-changing. Your father and I worked so hard to give you the education you needed, the opportunities we never had. And now your husband can give you everything you deserve. You must take it. You must. I felt my stomach sink. My mother had sacrificed everything for me. She had worked double shifts, skipped meals, gone without new clothes for years so that I could have a better life. And now she was telling me that this job was the reward, the proof that all her sacrifices had been worth it. How could I tell her that Michael was saying no? How could I explain that he was choosing family over money when she had spent her whole life chasing financial stability? How could I make her understand that sometimes the American dream isn't about more money, but about more presence? I couldn't. I didn't even try. I just said I love you and hung up the phone. And then I sat on the floor and cried because I felt like I was being torn in two. Michael's family understood. They had lived through his father's absence. They knew exactly why he was hesitating. But my family? They had never had the luxury of worrying about presents. They had been too busy worrying about survival. I was caught between two worlds, two cultures, two completely different definitions of what it meant to be a good provider, a good husband, a good father. And I didn't know how to bridge that gap. I didn't know how to make my mother understand that Michael's love was more valuable than any paycheck. I didn't know how to tell my family that I was proud of him for saying no. Even though every instinct I had grown up with was screaming at me to say yes. I walked out of the room and found Michael sitting on the couch, watching our daughter play. I sat down next to him and said, "We'll figure this out together." But inside, I was terrified. Because the pressure was just beginning. And the hardest conversation was still to come, a conversation that would test everything I believed about love, family, and sacrifice. The words my daughter said that changed everything. You know how sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources? That's exactly what happened to me on a completely ordinary Tuesday evening. I was tucking my daughter into bed, the same ritual we had done 1,000 times before, kiss on the forehead, covers pulled up to her chin. A whispered "I love you." But this time, she said something that stopped me cold. She said, "Mommy, why is Daddy sad?" I froze. I had been so careful. Michael and I had tried so hard to keep our arguments private, to shield her from the tension that had been building in our house for weeks. We thought we had been successful. We thought she hadn't noticed. But of course she had noticed. Children always notice. They see the silent conversations, the forced smiles, the way their parents' voices get a little too quiet when they walk into the room. And my 7-year-old daughter had seen something I hadn't even seen myself, that Michael was sad. Not angry. Not frustrated. Sad. I sat down on the edge of her bed, my heart pounding, and I said, "What makes you think Daddy's sad, sweetie?" She looked at me with those big, honest eyes and said, "He doesn't laugh as much. He used to laugh a lot. Now he just smiles." And then she said something that shattered me completely. "I don't want him to be sad. I want him to be happy. Even if that means we have to move away. I felt the air leave my lungs. My daughter, who was 7 years old, who had no concept of money or careers or the American dream, was telling me that she was willing to give up everything she knew so that her father could be happy. She didn't care about the bigger house or the better school or any of the things I had been so obsessed with. She just wanted her daddy to laugh again. I hugged her so tightly that she squeaked. And I held her for a long time, trying not to cry, trying to hold it together. But when I finally left her room and walked back to the living room, I broke down completely. Michael found me sobbing on the couch. I told him what our daughter had said. And I watched his face crumble. He sat down beside me and said, "She's willing to give up everything for me. And I'm willing to give up everything for her. But you and we keep fighting about what's best." And I realized, in that moment, that we had been so focused on winning the argument that we had forgotten the most important thing, that we were on the same team. We both wanted what was best for our daughter. We just had different ideas about what that looked like. I looked at Michael, really looked at him, and I said, "I'm sorry. I've been so focused on the money that I forgot to ask what you actually need. What do you need?" He looked at me, tears in his eyes, and said, "I need to know that we're going to be okay. No matter what I choose. I need to know that you'll still love me even if I don't make 3 times my salary." And I told him the truth that I had been avoiding for weeks, that I loved him for who he was, not for what he could provide. That he was already enough. That our family was already enough. But that conversation wasn't the end. Because the hardest decision was still ahead of us. And his final choice would prove to me that love is the most valuable currency in the world. His final decision. Michael held the phone in his hand for 2 weeks. 2 whole weeks of staring at it, picking it up, putting it down, walking away, and coming back. I watched him go through this ritual every single day, and my heart broke a little more each time. He was carrying the weight of our future on his shoulders, and I had finally stopped adding to that weight. I had finally stopped pushing. I had finally started listening. And what I heard when I listened was a man who was terrified of making the wrong choice. Not for himself, he had never cared much about his own success. But for us. For our daughter. For the family he had built and was desperate to protect. He would come home from work every evening, sit on the couch, and stare at the wall. He wasn't watching TV or scrolling through his phone. He was just thinking. Wrestling with himself. Trying to find the answer that would make everyone happy. And I realized, watching him, that there was no perfect answer. There was only the best answer. And that answer had to come from him. It couldn't come from me. It couldn't come from his mother or my mother or anyone else. He had to make this choice himself, and he had to live with the consequences. I stayed out of it. I stopped asking questions. I stopped offering opinions. I just made sure he had dinner, made sure our daughter was taken care of, and gave him space to do what he needed to do. And then, one Friday evening, he walked into the kitchen and set the phone down on the counter. He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in weeks. "Peace." He said, "I'm not taking the job. I didn't say anything. I just waited. And he said, I know what I want. I want this. I want us. I want to see my daughter grow up. I want to be there for every soccer game and every school play and every bedtime story. I don't want to be a father who's always somewhere else. I don't want to be the man who's always working. I've seen that life, and it's not for me. It's not for us. I felt tears streaming down my face, but this time they weren't tears of frustration or fear. They were tears of relief. Tears of pride. Tears of gratitude. Because my husband had just done something that most people would never do. He had walked away from a life-changing amount of money because he valued something more. He valued family. He valued presence. He valued us. I walked over to him, wrapped my arms around him, and held on like I would never let go. And I said, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of us. We're going to be okay. He hugged me back, and for the first time in weeks, I felt his body relax. The tension that had been living in his shoulders finally melted away. He had made his choice. And it was the right one. But I had no idea what was coming next. Because when word spread that Michael had turned down the job, everyone, friends, family, colleagues, had an opinion. And some of those opinions were not what I expected. Some of them made me question everything I thought I knew about success and sacrifice. And one of them would hurt more than any of the others. The reactions that surprised me most. The moment Michael told his family he had turned down the job, I braced myself for the worst. I expected his mother Margaret to be disappointed. I expected his father David to question his judgment. I expected his sister Emma to think he was crazy. But what actually happened was the complete opposite of everything I had prepared myself for. Margaret stood up from the kitchen table, walked over to Michael, and hugged him so tightly that he looked like a little boy in her arms. She said, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of the father you've become. And I watched Michael's face crumple. He had been so scared of disappointing his family, of being judged for walking away from such a huge opportunity. And instead of judgment, he received validation. Instead of criticism, he received love. David shook his hand and said, Son, I made a lot of mistakes. I chased a lot of things that didn't matter. You just made a choice that took me decades to understand. You're a better man than I ever was. I started crying, again. Because crying is apparently my permanent emotional state now, and I realized that this family had taught me something I never expected. They had taught me that success isn't about how much you earn. It's about who you become. But not everyone saw it that way. Not everyone understood. And the hardest reaction came from my own family, thousands of miles away. When I finally told my mother that Michael had turned down the job, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. And then she said, He did what? I could hear the disappointment in her voice. I could hear the years of struggle, the sacrifices she had made, the hopes she had pinned on me finally escaping poverty. She couldn't understand. She couldn't see how anyone could walk away from that kind of money. She said, But you could have had everything. A house. a car, security. Why would he throw that away? I took a deep breath and told her the truth. Because he doesn't want to be a ghost in his daughter's life. Because he wants to be there for every school play and every bedtime story. Because he knows that money can't buy the moments we're living right now. My mother was quiet for a long time. And then she said, I never had that choice. I never had the luxury of choosing presents over money. I had to choose survival. Every single day. I felt a lump in my throat. I know, Mom. And I love you for everything you sacrificed. But this is our life. This is our choice. And we're choosing each other. She was quiet again, and then she said, You're braver than I ever was. I hung up the phone and walked back to Michael. He was sitting on the couch, holding our daughter, reading her a story. And I realized, in that moment, that every single person in our lives had an opinion, but the only opinion that really mattered was our own. And we had chosen love. But the biggest surprise was still to come, a surprise that would prove, beyond any doubt, that Michael had made the right decision. A surprise that would come from the most unexpected place and change our lives forever. 1 year later, looking back. I want to tell you about the surprising thing that happened exactly 1 year after Michael turned down the job. But first, let me paint you a picture of our life at that point. We were still in the same house. I was still working the same job. Our daughter was still at the same school. On the surface, absolutely nothing had changed. But underneath, everything had changed. Michael was happier. I mean, truly, deeply, visibly happier. He laughed more. He joked more. He came home from work with energy instead of exhaustion. He played with our daughter in the backyard until the sun went down. He took me on dates again, not fancy ones, just simple ones, walks in the park, coffee on the porch, conversations that lasted late into the night. And I realized that we had been so focused on what we were giving up that we had forgotten what we were keeping. We were keeping each other. We were keeping our family intact. We were keeping the life we had built together, brick by brick, moment by moment. And that life, I finally understood, was worth more than any paycheck. But the biggest surprise came when Michael's company announced that he was being promoted anyway. Not to the job he had turned down, but to a different position, one that came with a raise, yes, but more importantly, one that came with more flexibility, more time at home, more trust, more respect. When he told me, I couldn't believe it. How is this possible? I asked. You turned down the biggest opportunity they ever offered you. Michael smiled and said, because they realized something. They realized I was the kind of person who valued family over money. And those are exactly the kind of people they want to keep. Loyal people. Honest people. People who make decisions based on what matters, not on what pays the most. I sat there, completely stunned. All those months of worrying about his career. All those months of thinking he had damaged his future, and his integrity had actually made him more valuable. He hadn't lost anything. He had gained everything. He had gained their respect. He had gained my trust. He had gained something far more precious than a bigger house or a faster car. He had gained peace. I thought about all the people I knew who had chased money and ended up miserable. I thought about all the families I had seen fall apart because the father was never there. I thought about my own childhood, where money was always the goal but never the solution. And I realized that Michael had done something revolutionary. He had chosen love over money. He had chosen presence over success. He had chosen family over everything. And in doing so, he had made us all richer than any amount of money ever could. But the lesson wasn't over yet. Because the most important part of this story was still to come, the part where I finally understood, deep in my bones, what real wealth actually means. And it came from a conversation with my daughter that I will never, ever forget. What true wealth really means. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with my daughter that completely redefined everything I thought I knew about wealth. It happened on a quiet Saturday morning, about a year after Michael had turned down the job. We were sitting in our tiny backyard, the one I had complained about so many times, and my daughter was drawing with chalk on the patio. I was drinking coffee, scrolling through my phone, feeling that familiar pang of envy as I saw photos of friends who had bigger houses, nicer cars, more expensive vacations. I had been doing this for months. Comparing, wishing, wondering what life would have been like if Michael had taken that job. And then my daughter looked up at me and said, "Mommy, why do you always look so sad when you look at your phone?" I felt my face flush. "I'm not sad, sweetie," I said. "I'm just a-thinking." She put down her chalk, walked over to me, and climbed into my lap. And then she said something that made my entire world shift. She said, "I don't want to be rich. I just want us to be together. That's all I need." I felt the air leave my lungs. Here was a 7-year-old, who had no concept of money or success or status, telling me exactly what mattered. She didn't want a bigger house. She didn't want a nicer car. She didn't want any of the things I had been obsessing over. She just wanted her family. She just wanted us. And I realized, in that moment, that I had been so focused on what I thought we were missing that I had completely missed what we already had. We had love. We had laughter. We had each other. And that was more than enough. I hugged her tightly and said, "You're right, sweetie. You're absolutely right." She smiled, kissed my cheek, and went back to her chalk drawing. And I sat there, watching her, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over me. I thought about all the things I had been chasing: money, status, a life that looked impressive to other people. And I realized that none of it mattered. What mattered was this moment. Right here. Right now. What mattered was my daughter's laughter, my husband's love, the warmth of the sun on my skin. What mattered was the life we had built, not the life we could have built with more money. I walked inside and found Michael doing the dishes. I wrapped my arms around him from behind and said, "Thank you." He turned around, confused. "For what?" "For choosing us," I said. For being brave enough to say no to something that looked good so you could say yes to something that actually mattered. He smiled, set down the dish he was washing, and hugged me back. "I'd do it again," he said. 1,000 times. I'd choose you every single time. And I believed him. I finally, completely, utterly believed him. Because he had proven it. Not with words, but with action. He had walked away from a fortune to keep his family intact. And that, I realized, was the bravest thing I had ever seen. But the final lesson was still coming. The lesson that would seal everything I had learned and make me understand, once and for all, what it really means to be rich. Family is the real wealth. Do you know what the most important thing I've learned in the past 3 years is? It's not that money doesn't matter. It's that money is just one part of a much bigger picture. And if you let it become the whole picture, you'll miss everything that actually makes life worth living. 3 years after Michael turned down that job, I can honestly say that we made the right choice. Not because it was easy, it wasn't. There were moments of doubt. There were moments when I wondered what life would have been like if we had taken the money. There were moments when I looked at friends with bigger houses and felt that familiar pang of envy. But those moments passed. And what remained was something far more valuable than any paycheck. What remained was us. Michael was still there for every dinner, every bedtime, every school play. He was still the father who laughed at our daughter's jokes and helped her with her homework and taught her how to ride a bike. He wasn't a ghost in her life. He was a presence. A steady, reliable, loving presence. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift he could have given her. I thought about my mother, who had spent her whole life chasing money so I could have a better life. She had sacrificed so much, her time, her energy, her presence, and she had done it out of love. But she had also missed so much. She had missed the moments that couldn't be bought. And I was determined not to make the same mistake. I wanted to be there for my daughter. I wanted to be present in her life in a way that my mother couldn't be present in mine. And Michael had made that possible. He had chosen family over money, and in doing so, he had given us all something priceless. He had given us time. He had given us presence. He had given us each other. I looked at my husband sitting on the couch, reading a book to our daughter, and I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. We didn't have the biggest house or the fanciest car. We didn't have the vacations or the designer clothes or any of the things I used to think defined success. But we had something better. We had love. We had laughter. We had a family that was intact, whole, and deeply, profoundly happy. And I realized, in that moment, that this was the real wealth. Not the money in the bank. Not the things we could buy. But the people we got to share our lives with. The moments we got to experience together. The love that we built, day by day, choice by choice. Michael chose family over money. And that choice made us richer than any amount of money ever could. I walked over to the couch, sat down beside them, and wrapped my arms around both of them. And I thought, this is it. This is everything. And I was right. That's all for today. I'll make more similar videos in the future. Don't forget to subscribe to see them.